As far as stopping, interrupting, can I anytime emergency have to go to the bathroom?
Absolutely.
Or,
You're in charge.
oh,
You're in charge.
first time in my life.
You need to go, you need to stop.
Is my hair okay?
Yeah, looks good. You have so much hair.
And just note that it'll keep rolling
Okay, so
even when you take the break.
Mhm.
There are things you don't want.
do you edit it after?
I don't know if they do or
You're
not.
not gonna edit out the breaks?
I'm sure they would.
I'm pretty sure they do, yeah.
Yeah. But we just keep it rolling, so it's just one continuous flip.
How do you want me to do the slate?
Let's see, it's darker.
Oh.
Oh, okay.
Much better.
You want me to?
Oh, you got the six,
I have
perfect.
one, yeah.
He just needs to hold it, and you can read it off while he's holding it for a minute.
He's holding it?
Yeah.
Oh,
And you can just hold it straight up to your phone. Just like that, perfect.
and I should read it,
I'll read it.
or you read it?
Whenever you're ready.
Okay.
Ready?
Today is August 30th, 2023. I am interviewing Peter Gorog of the, on behalf of the USC Shoah Foundation. My name is Anat Bar Cohen. The interview is taking place in Arlington, Virginia, the United States of America. The language is in, of the interview is in English.
That's it.
That's-
Here, I put it for sure you holding it too.
Oh,
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Okay.
So do I.
Ready? One, two, three.
There we go. All right, and we are rolling, so whenever you guys are ready.
Okay. Good morning.
good morning.
Would you please state your name?
Peter Gorog,
Could you spell your last name, please?
Gorog.
Did you have any other names?
Yes, I was born by the last name Grunwald.
And what did people call you when you were growing up?
Peter,
Peter Grunwald.
yes, until age 22.
Is there any significance to your name? Were you named for someone?
Yes, I was born in a Jewish family in Hungary, and Jewish people usually have Jewish-sounding names, and so it was easy to pinpoint them at that time. After we survived the Holocaust, I went to school. I still had the name of my father's family, Grunwald, until I entered to college. And at that time, my mom told me that this would be a good time to change my name to some Hungarian name because anti-Semitism may come back later, and she didn't want me to be an object of discrimination because of my Jewish-sounding name. As a good, obedient Jewish boy, I changed my name to a Hungarian-sounding name in 1962 when I entered to college.
But your first name, were you named for someone in the family, Peter?
Sorry, I didn't catch the question.
Your first name, Peter, is that named for someone in the family?
Interestingly enough, Jewish families didn't have a lot of Peters, but my father had a very good childhood friend, and I think he died young, and in honoring him, my parents decided for Peter.
What is your birth date?
March 10, 1941,
And where were you born?
in Budapest, Hungary.
And could you give us the names of your parents, where they were born and when?
My father, his name was Grünwald Árpád. In Hungary, the first name is the last name is the first name. He was born in Budapest in 1907. My mother's maiden name, Schönfeld Olga. She was born in Ungvár, which was that time part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and it was Hungary. And she was born in 1907 also.
Could you spell the name of the town?
Ungvar.
Did you have any siblings?
No, I don't. My parents, unfortunately, were separated when I was born, and they never had a chance to have another child. My mother remarried in 1954, and my stepfather had a son from his first marriage.
And what was his name?
Tamás, Tamas.
And what was your stepfather's name?
Weiss Gyula. Actually, by the time he married my mother, he changed his name to a Hungarian-sounding name. It was Vékes, Vekes.
And your grandparents' names?
My grandparents, on my mother's side, Schönfeld Salamon. My grandmother on my mother's side, Neuwirth Regina. On my father's side, my grandfather, Grünwald Jakob. And my grandmother's maiden name was Schlesinger, I believe, Rose or Rosalia. I don't remember her last name. Unfortunately, I never had a chance to know my grandparents.
So were your grandparents, did they survive the war?
Two of them survived, but barely. The Budapest ghetto was liberated in January 1945, and a few months later, my grandfather on my mother's side and my grandmother on my father's side, who survived, died in a common illness. They were just very weak.
So I know you were a very, very young child. You were born during the war and so on. So don't worry about the sequence of events or whether you have firsthand memories or these are stories that were told to you or so on, that you want to hear everything. Is there anything that you can say about your parents before the war, about their home life, about their religious life, about their occupation?
Obviously, I was born in the middle of the Holocaust. Everything I know about my parents, I know because my mom told some of the stories throughout the years. During the Holocaust stories, unfortunately, very late in her life, she just couldn't bring herself to tell me all the horrors we went through, or they went through even before the Holocaust. So besides her personal memories, I made an interview, a video interview with her in 1994, She was 86 years old. And it's about almost 3 hours interview, videotaped, and she told the family story in great details. And that tape is currently in the collection of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, available for anybody who wants to see it. It's in Hungarian. I am working on the English translation of the contents, mostly for my children and grandchildren who don't speak Hungarian, and for the museum to make it available for researchers.
Can you tell us some of the highlights did she talk about her life?
She talked about her life in great details, about her siblings. She had 9 siblings. 5 of them survived the Holocaust. Some died even before in illness, because of illness. And so I know a little bit about their stories. Unfortunately, at the same time, I don't know much about my father's family, because nobody survived the Holocaust. Nobody was able to tell me their stories. And my mom knew very little about it for various reasons. But there are documents and pictures. I can put together some of my father's stories.
So what were the circumstances around your birth?
Holocaust history in Hungary is different from rest of Europe because it wasn't occupied until 1944 by the Germans. Nevertheless, the Hungarian government was as anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish as the German ones. Hungarian laws were as strict as the Nuremberg laws. So my parents' life until the mid-1930s were regular, normal, middle-class life, as I can describe. And my mom came from a very Orthodox Jewish family. My great-grandfather was a rabbi in a small town, which at that time was part of Hungary, and now it's part of the Slovakia. My grandfather was observant Orthodox Jew. He went to the Pressburg, today it's Bratislava, capital of Slovakia, yeshiva. He finished his studies there, but he never became a Orthodox clergy. He had a big family and he had to take care of it. My mom got a very religious, strict upbringing. My father came from a family which is more or less equivalent to conservative Judaism. Here he lived in Budapest, and city dwellers or Jews who lived in cities, they tried to assimilate more and more, and they gave up some of their traditions. What I do know, my father was bar mitzvahd. I do have his phylactery. It survived the Holocaust. My parents observed the Shabbat. I know that my mother-in-law grandparents, although they were Orthodox, but only my grandfather went to the synagogue, to the shul on Shabbat, not the rest of the family. They observed all the Jewish holidays. and they were married. My parents were married in a synagogue. Their life before the war started was again a normal life. My father was a clerk, office manager in a publishing company in Budapest until 1940. My mom got pregnant with me in June, I believe, 1940. A couple of months later, my father was called into the Hungarian so-called labor service, which was specific to Hungary, which meant that Jewish males between the age 18 and 55, I believe, they had to serve in the labor service, which was a kind of misnomer, at least the English translation. The Hungarian name is munkaszolgálat, and the word munka is work, labor, and the szolgálat has the root from szolga, which means slaves. So theoretically and practically, they were actually slave laborers, did all the dirty work for the Hungarian army. So the way it worked that people served for 3 months in the labor service. They were let go for a couple of weeks. They were called back for another 3 months. My father was lucky that at the time I was born, he was at home. So the very few pictures I have with him were taken at that time. I was born on March 10, 41. And a few weeks later, he had to go to serve again. He was able to come back one more time while I was an infant, 6 months old. And there are some pictures taken by professional photographers at that time. He was called back, and he never came back again.
What are your earliest memories?
My earliest memories, probably when I was about 3 years old, and generally psychiatrists say that children's memory, real memory, starts around age 3. And that's when actually the German occupation of Hungary started in 1944. And so I have personal memories of our ordeal during the German occupation. And before that, I have some memories. My mom was a female hat maker. She had a very good business, and she had her shop in our apartment. And I remember her making those fancy hats, and I remember that I liked specifically hats she made for weddings. And I tried them on and were prancing in front of the mirror. And unfortunately, there are no pictures, but I do have that personal memory.
In 1944, when the Germans occupied Hungary and you were 3 years old, did you have any sense of what was going on? Was there an explanation about why your father was not there?
Not really. I mean, I know that were people marching on the street in military uniform and tanks rolled into Budapest, and I was fascinated by them being a young boy. My mom sheltered me as much as possible, so I really didn't know where my father was. It wasn't like I'm missing him, because most of my friends were Jewish boys whose father served in the military, so somehow it was natural that I had just my mom around. What I do remember that in April 1944, Jewish families were ordered to leave their apartments and move to so-called designated houses. Houses were designated by the government, marked by the Yellow Star of David, and the Hungarian name for it was Csillagos ház, star buildings, Yellow Star buildings. And that time the Budapest ghetto was not set up, but most of the Jews lived in an area where what became later on the Budapest ghetto, and most of the designated houses were there. So Jews, non-Jews from those buildings had to move out, and Jewish families had to move in. And those apartments were very crowded. Sometimes 2-3 families were sharing a 2-bedroom apartment. And when we had to leave our apartment where my parents got married, where I was born, we didn't go to the Budapest ghetto or one of the designated houses. Actually, the house we went to, and I know from my mom's memory, was owned by a far removed relative of us, and they had their apartment in that building, which was in a Christian neighborhood, but that was one house which was designated for Jews, and that's where we moved with my mother. She could only take so much, whatever she was able to pack in a small suitcase, and actually she made a kind of homemade backpack from the canvas. Actually, she told me that my parents were outdoorsy people, and they had a kayak, and the kayak had a sail. And so my mom used that canvas sail to make a makeshift backpack. She put as much personal belongings as she could, and she moved to this house in Budapest, and that was April or early May in 1944. We lived there until, I believe, in October, yes. That's when the deportation of the Hungarian Jews in Budapest started. The deportation started as soon as the Germans came in late April, and in the matter of 3 months, about 450,000 Hungarian Jews were deported, mostly to Auschwitz, but other camps also. The way they organized, they rounded up first the Jews in the countryside. And so those Jews, like us who lived in Budapest, were relatively safe until the fall of 1944, and we lived in this Yellow Star house. In October 1944, the Germans were retreating from the Soviet Union and other occupied territories. The Soviet troops were already in eastern Hungary, and the Germans were afraid that the Hungarian government would change side, like the Romanians and the Italians did before. So they removed the Hungarian government, which was German-friendly, and they installed the far-right Hungarian Fascist Party, the so-called Arrow Cross, to govern Hungary. And that's when the trouble really started for the Hungarians who lived in Hungarian Jews who lived in Budapest. In October, late October, a decree came out that all the Jews of Budapest had to show up on a certain date at a certain time at the Budapest brickyard. Just outside Budapest, I think it's named Óbuda, there was a brickyard which had a train connection to bring in the raw material and take out the bricks, and that was very convenient for the Germans to gather the Jews and transport them to the camps. The way it worked, Jews didn't have radios. Radios were confiscated many years before with all the valuables by the government. And so the people knew about government decrees and orders in Budapest by posters which were posted on the walls of various houses overnight, and when there was no curfew, Jews were allowed to go out only for a few hours in the last few months of the war to the streets. They saw those posters. My mother, by that time, only my mother and I was there. My father, meantime, was taken in late 1942 to Ukraine with the Hungarian army when the Germans attacked the Soviet Union. And my husband, sorry, my father died in Ukraine in 1943. So only my mother and I was living together until 1944 in this Yellow Star house, when this decree came out that all the Jews have to show up at the brickyard. And it was a kind of voluntary, in a sense that the government said something. Jews were good law-abiding citizens, and they did what the government said. So most of the people went, and of course they weren't told that they're gonna be taken to the death camps. They were told that they will be relocated to eastern Poland and they will start a new life. They were able to bring whatever one suitcase of stuff with them. Anyway, what happened to my mother, that the lady who owned the apartment went out shopping the day before Jews were supposed to show up at the brickyard, and he met a member of the Hungarian army they knew from somewhere. And he told her that because she was a war widow, her husband was taken away. Also, war widows don't have to go to the brickyard. So my mom and Mrs. Ormos, that was her name, didn't go to the brickyard. Next day, two Hungarian policemen, it was called gendarmerie, they had a very fancy uniform, and I remember when they showed up at our apartment, and they arrested my mother. I don't know how they knew that they didn't show up. Obviously, somebody from the neighborhood reported them, because by that time the whole apartment building was empty except my mom, myself, and Mrs. Ormos and her daughter. So my mom and Mrs. Ormos' daughter was arrested, but not Mrs. Ormos, because she was over 40, and I think this decree was just for females under 40 or 45, I don't know exactly. Anyway, my mom was taken away. I was left behind with Mrs. Ormos, and I remember the very moment, because when the police or gendarmerie came in, I started crying. I was afraid of them, because my mom always told me if I don't eat my food, the police will come and take me away. This time they took her away. Although I didn't know what was going on, she assured me that she will be back soon. Well, the soon was about 3 weeks, actually exactly 3 weeks, as my mom told me. That time I didn't have sense of time, really. She was taken first to a police barrack overnight, and from there she was taken to an infamous Jewish detention center. I forgot the name, Moshony Street Detention Center. This was a regular detention center, jail, mostly for common criminals, thieves, robbers, prostitutes, and actually from the police station to the detention center, my mother was taken with a truck full with other people. There were only 2 Jews, she and Mrs. Ormos's daughter. The rest of them were prostitutes and common criminals. They were taken to this place where there was a big hall with cots on the floor, 80, 100 people in one room, and they were staying there for 30 days. Nobody told them anything, what was going on, what's going to happen to them. They were just kept there. Of course, the circumstances, hygiene was horrible. My mom was always very meticulous about, and even under the worst circumstances, she took a cold shower. But after 3 weeks, They lined up everything, and this room was on the 3rd floor. They had to go down to the 1st floor, and everybody had to bring whatever documents they had to prove who they were and whatever excuses they might have not to be there. So my mom, when it was her turn to go to the table, my mom had a tremendous memory. She remembered dates and street names and street numbers and people's names. And in the video interview, she mentioned the colonel who interrogated the people in the detention center. She quoted him by name. When it was her turn, she told who she was, that she was a war widow, which was a kind of lie, because Jewish people who died in Ukraine during war activities were declared missing person or dead if their body was found, but their spouses were not war widows, which entitled these widows to certain privilege in Hungary, some stipend and extra rationing when food was rationed, and it was during the last 2 years of the war. So my mom wasn't officially a war widow, but she had a paper from the Hungarian Red Cross, which only stated that my father disappeared in Ukraine near to the city of Ostrogorsk, and I still have that paper. In January 43, and she had another paper, namely she got a paper from the city government of Budapest a year later, which declared her a widower for some kind of legal purposes. Anyway, with these two documents, plus telling this officer that she left a 3-year-old child with neighbors, she didn't say it was a far removed relative, to strangers practically. That's what she presented. And she didn't know when she told the story whether it was a story the colonel believed in or he might have pity on her. But next day she was released, and only 2 persons, she and an elderly lady, was released. She doesn't know what happened to the rest of the people. Somehow, and I don't know how, she remembered that there were 84 Jewish people in that detention center during the 3 weeks she stayed there. 2 of them were released. She came back. It was an arduous trip from the detention center to where we lived in another part of Budapest, about 5 or 6 miles away. There was a curfew, 24-hour curfew, so nobody ever should have stayed on the street. There were militiamen, not in uniform, but just armband, guarding the streets and arresting anybody who was walking on the street. My mom was stopped twice on her way. She told her story to these militiamen. They were lenient enough. They let her go, didn't arrest her, but they actually warned her that the next time she bumps into a militiaman, she might be not that lucky. Anyway, she came back to the apartment. We had to move immediately because we weren't safe anymore. And this time the Budapest ghetto was already established in October, early November, I believe. But we didn't go there. Mom knew it wasn't a good idea to go where all the other Jews were, because by that time they knew that Jews were transported to the death camps. So what she did was that by that time she got a Schutzpass from the Swiss embassy. Karl Lutz, who was I think the deputy ambassador from Switzerland to Budapest, gave out false documents for 5,000 to 10,000 people, which saved their life temporarily. And also he and other ambassadors from neutral countries, like Raoul Wallenberg from Sweden, the Spanish ambassador, Angel, his first name was Angel, and he was called the Angel of Budapest because he saved a lot of Jews also. Anyway, they rented out apartment houses, high-rises, at a certain part of Budapest, and they put the plaque of the embassy on these houses, and by international laws, they were protected from the local authorities to enter in those houses. So Jews who were able to go to those houses had a temporary respite, a break, while they stayed in those protected houses. My mom told the story. She went one of the houses which were protected by the Swiss embassy. She walked into the house. She saw an apartment. The door was open. She walked in. She saw an empty room. She moved there. She knew exactly the street address. The apartment was overlooking to the Danube River. Anyway, the other room was occupied, and the living room was occupied. Two elderly people. She remembered one was a lawyer, one was just an elderly widow. They first protested that there are no more space in the apartment. Mom said there was no way that she's going to move out from there, and we stayed, and they had no choice. They accepted. She told me about the life in these protected houses, 2, 3, 4 families in a 2-3 bedroom apartment, very crowded, food hardly available. Whatever food there was, they shared. These apartment houses had a laundry room on the top floor, which had water and some cooking facilities, and that's where the woman brought all whatever food they had, made their meal, shared with everybody, even those who weren't able to contribute. And we spent most of our time in the basement. These are personal memories. I remember the house. I remembered it was a elevated floor. It wasn't a real second floor from the ground floor. It was halfway up for whatever reason. I don't know. A few steps we had to walk up. I remember hearing the bombing of the Budapest. I do not, but my mom remembered the shots from the Danube River when people later on were led away from these protected houses, some of them to the ghetto, some to the railway station or the brickyard, some to the Danube River where they were shot into the river. And she remembers those shots. We spent most of our time in the basement of the building. It was a temporary bomb shelter. Those buildings weren't built for bomb shelter, but that was the safest place to stay because the Allied, the Soviets from the east and the Americans from the west were bombing Budapest relentlessly during daytime. So we spent our time in the basement, and we lived there until early November. I believe the Arrow Cross came to power in October 15, and then they started to arrest people, even to protect these houses. These Nazi thugs did not care about international laws or anything. They came and they systematically emptied these buildings. They started somehow on the 4th floor and they came down floor by floor. My mom told me she assumed there was a quota that every day they had to arrest certain number of people. And so we were lucky. And we were lucky so many times during the Holocaust that we lived on the 1st floor. So we were practically the last one to be led away. And then we were also lucky that we weren't taken. What happened, and I remember this one because we children were, during 2 bombing raids, we were playing in the courtyard of the apartment building. It was a closed courtyard. And we were little boys and we were playing thieves and police, or robber than police, or cowboys and Indians. And we had makeshift things, the brooms and a piece of stick to imitate rifles and revolvers, and we were shooting each other. And those young Nazi thugs were sitting there and laughing at the little Jewish boys with yellow Star of David on their clothes, shooting each other. And sometimes they were, I don't know how to explain this. They removed the ammunition from their rifles or pistols, and they gave us to play with it. And we were happy to have it because those were real guns. We were little boys. And so the irony of the situation struck me lately when I realized what we did. Anyway, during this time, we somehow befriended these Nazis. We were little boys. We didn't know who they were, what they wanted to do us. And actually, my mom told me that I was so enamored by the Nazi uniform and the the rifle that I told her that when I grow up, I'm going to be an Aero Cross soldier. And I didn't know what it was. Anyway, when it was our turn and the Nazis, the Aero Cross, show up at our door, they wanted to take my mom away. At that time, my mom was telling me that I was still playing in the courtyard. And so one of these Nazis asked where I was. And my mom told him that little Peter, by name, is in the courtyard. And this guy remembered that he played with me or laughed at me at the courtyard. And he told my mom, "Are you the mother of that little Peter?" And she said, "Yes." And he told to his comrades, "Let's go to the next apartment." They went there. We were lucky. We were left behind. Mom gathered me immediately, and the next day, the remaining people, there were only a few of us, were led away from this house. Interestingly enough, by that time, the deportation practically came to a halt because railway lines were bombed, and so the only people who died at this time died by the hands of the Nazi Aero Cross, or by starvation or common illness for which there were no medications or doctors available. Anyway, so a few people, 15 maybe, who were still alive, were led away by two Aero Cross people from this protected house to the Budapest ghetto. That was the time when we had to walk again 5 miles. I was crying. I was not even 4 years old. It was cold. It was a terrible cold winter, 1944-45. In November, there were already snow on the streets. Anyway, we walked to the Budapest ghetto, and we lived there for the next however many weeks were left until 1945, January 17, when the Soviet Red Army came in and liberated to the ghetto. The circumstances were just undescribable. This time, buildings were bombed out. When we were let loose, when we were inside the ghetto, the Nazis told us, "Go to any building, you will find lots of empty apartments, just take one." And actually, they kind of encouraged people, telling them that the Soviets are in 10 days distance from Budapest, and the end will be here soon. And so we went to an apartment building. It wasn't bombed out, but because of the bombing, all the windows were gone. Again, extremely cold. We spent the nights, or the days and most of the nights, in the basement. These old buildings, the house before the protected house, the Swiss house, were a relatively new building, a relatively nice cement floor and everything. This had dirt floor in the basement. That's where we sat. I got a very bad case of cold. Somebody had pity on us, and one apartment had windows. Somebody repaired it, and they let my mom and myself stay in that apartment. They made a makeshift bed from a piece of furniture where you hang your clothes. They had it sideways, so it was flat. And my mom had her fur coat. That's what we use for blanket, and that's where we lived for approximately 3 or 4 weeks until January 19.
Where were your grandparents and other family members during all this period?
What I know is my father died in the Hungarian slave labor service. So did two of her.
How did you know that? How were you notified of that?
That my father died? Well, actually, I don't. The paper my mom got was that my father disappeared during war activities. It could have meant anything. It could have meant that he was died during the fighting. It could have meant that he was frozen to death because these people didn't have adequate clothes for the harsh Russian winter. Snow knee-highs or even higher, and they had to walk, food hardly available, and so many people were frozen. We know what happened in general because some people survived. Some people were taken as POWs by the Russians. They were taken to Siberia. They survived the harsh circumstances. Some of them, again, many of them died there, but some of them survived until the war was over. And in 1945, late 45, 46, the Soviets let those surviving POWs come back to Hungary. So they were the ones who told their stories. Some of them wrote memoirs. What happened to my mom, that my mom was during the war in touch with other Jewish wives whose husbands were taken, and they tried to get information from various channels and shared those information. And they located one person who came back with the Hungarian army. The Hungarian army retreated all the way back to Hungary, and some of them were able to come back to Budapest. So one of those wives located one person who came back from the squadron or whatever unit my father served, and he was the only survivor of hundreds of Jews who served there and were able to come back. Again, some might have been taken to Siberia. Anyway, he remembered that there was one member of this unit who wrote a diary. And he remembered reading this diary. This person died before he came back, I think in typhoid fever. But this gentleman who came back, his name was Mr. Kraus. My mother remembered his name. Read the diary, and he remembered one line that Arpad, my father, actually he was mentioned by his nickname, Arpi, was left behind. Again, what we know about those people who were left behind, they were just so weak they couldn't march any longer. And many of them couldn't march. They sat down and they were frozen to death in no time. We know from these memoirs that some of them were killed by the officers of the Hungarian Regular Army. And after the war, they were called to justice, they were tried, and their defense was that they died, or they shot some of these people out of mercy, that they didn't want these people to suffer a few hours more, they just killed them. Whether it's true, we will never know. We also know from the memoirs that some of these people died because the people in these slave labor units were used to defuse mines when they were still marching into Soviet Union, and the Russians, Soviets at that time, retreated. They left minefield to slow down the Germans and the Hungarians. And so this minefield had to be diffused, and they used the people who served in the Hungarian labor service to march through the minefields, and as they marched, the mines exploded, and so did the people. So again, my mother's best hope was that my father survived. He was taken to a POW camp, and whatever happened from then, it was up to her imagination. In the interview, she jokingly said that she might have fallen in love with the Russian babushka and got married and started a new family. It was joke. She used this joke to say that how good their marriage, telling me how good their marriage was, that everybody wanted to have a marriage like yours. So this one didn't happen to my father. So that's what I know, or I suspect, assume about my father. About his two brothers, Imre and Laszlo. Imre was a younger brother. Laszlo was the younger, Imre was the older brother. They were conscripted into this labor service. They were taken to Ukraine, and we don't know anything what happened to them. Again, nobody from my father's family survived the Holocaust. The older brother, Imre, was married. They never had children. And Laszlo, I think he was married, but they didn't have children. Either their father, my grandfather, died in 1929. My mother didn't even know him because he died even before she started to date my father. My grandmother, on the other hand, survived in the Budapest ghetto and lived another few months. She was elderly, weak, and she died in a common cold. I do remember her personally only because we visited her in the hospital, and actually we lived together for a little while after the war when my mom left me with my other grandparents and her while she went to the countryside to get food and everything else. That's another story. Anyway, my grandmother reminded me, at that time I didn't know Franz Liszt, the famous Hungarian composer who had white, long hair, and my grandmother had exactly the same. So when I first saw that picture of Liszt Ferenc or Franz Liszt, I said, this is my grandmother. Mm-hmm. And, well, anyway, so that's what I know from my father's family. From my mother's family, two of her siblings, Ilona and Laszlo, came to the United States just before the Holocaust. Ilona came because she had a sponsor, an aunt whose family came around the turn of the last century, and she could come to the United States only because she was born what was that time Czechoslovakia. She was born in Hungary, but the borders moved after World War I, and the American government had a very strict quota. Unfortunately, many Jews who were able, could have come to the United States, had sponsored, couldn't come because just a certain number were allowed to come. However, when the Nazi Germany occupied Czechoslovakia, the American government gave an exemption to Czech citizens, regardless the quota. If they could, they come to the United States. And Aunt Ilona used this opportunity, and she went in 1938. Uncle Laszlo, he changed his name to Lester after he came to the United States. He was in Hungary until 1941. I was already born, my cousin Jutka was already born, and he was in the labor service. But he had a passport, a Hungarian passport, and he had American visa also, because he was born in Prešov, Eperjes, which was at that time part of Czechoslovakia. And between two terms in the labor service, Uncle Laszlo or Lester took his passport, took his American visa, got on the train, and left Hungary. He traveled through Nazi-occupied Europe, Austria, Germany, France, until he got to Spain and Portugal. and he left one of the last ship, left Portugal with Jewish refugees to the United States. And so two of them survived. Two of my aunts, Aunt Gabriela was her name, and Aunt Iboya, Ibi, they survived under horrible circumstances, and their stories and other story, but they survived in Budapest, and they lived in the Budapest ghetto in the last few months also. Actually, they lived there even before the war, because it just happened that their apartment happened to be on the street which became part of the Budapest ghetto.
Where were you when the Soviets liberated Budapest?
We were staying in the Budapest ghetto in an apartment. My mother recalled exactly where it was. He told me she couldn't remember the street number, but the street name, it was the corner of Veselényi Street and I believe Nyár utca. Anyway, later on I visited Budapest, and that's when actually I learned our whole Holocaust history. I was in my 50s living in the United States when my mom opened up and told everything. So she pinpointed the exact building where we lived for the last few weeks of the Nazi occupation. And when the Russians came in, I remember that they gave us candies. And later on, during the video interview, my mom told me that when the Russians came in, they were looking for weapons and ammunitions and gave out so-called vitamin candies. I think these troops were distributing to survivors, not just Jews, any survivors, these vitamins, because we were really deprived and weak, to just bring us back to health. Well, for me it was candy, and I liked it, and I remember. And I remember going back from the ghetto to our apartment building. I learned from the video interview that actually my mom left me behind with whomsoever lived in that apartment building at that time. And she came back to the apartment building by herself first to make sure that it was there, because most of the buildings were bombed out. So she walked back. It was relatively close, maybe a 15, 20 minutes walk from the ghetto to our apartment building, and the house was there. Our house, again, many lucky things. This was one of them. Windows, of course, they were all gone, but the building itself was almost intact. She walked up to our apartment. The family who took over was still there. The person who opened the door for her was, she remembered their name, and actually I remember their name because for a while we lived with them. Mr. Freifogel, opened the door, and he was very angry at Mom. What are you doing here? Why didn't you die? You weren't supposed to be here. Horrible things he said. Fortunately, his wife, Mrs. Freifogel, was much nicer. Somehow she made peace with my mom, and she said, okay, you guys can come back. We're going to empty one room for you. How generous it was. Anyway, so next day, whatever belongings we had left, my mom somehow found a sled. Everything was abandoned in Budapest streets at that time, and she found a big sled for 6 people. So she put everything we had on that sled, including me, and she pulled me back to our apartment. There was big snow all over the place. I do remember the trip back. I remember seeing the bombed out houses, the snow. I remember dead horses. I remember dead bodies under the snow. Anyway, we went back to an apartment. We occupied one room, the couple, and other room. Actually, interestingly enough, I remember they slept in the kitchen because the kitchen was the warmest part of the apartment. There was an old-fashioned stove, wood-burning stove, where they were able to, whatever food they could cook. And so they spent the night there. We spent in one of the cold rooms. There was no wood or coal or anything available. Anyway, it turned out that the family finally got more friendly. They shared whatever food they had with us, and they had actually, according to Mom, plenty. I know that I don't remember being hungry, interestingly enough, at that time. And we shared the apartment until they moved out. I don't know, and my mom didn't tell the circumstances, whether they moved out voluntarily or because after the war, the new government deported ethnic Germans from Hungary just because some of them joined the Nazis, some of them committed atrocities, but the great majority of them been living there for hundreds of years, just like the Jews. They were brought in because they had good trades, and they lived Hungarians like everybody else. They had German-sounding names, but they were ethnic Germans, Swabish, I remember that's the name from southern Germany. So anyway, after the war, kind of reverse discrimination, ethnic Germans were expelled from Hungary, and probably this family had to move out. I think it happened in other countries. I know it happened in Czechoslovakia also.
So you and your mother stayed in the apartment. Did she search for any living relatives? Did she?
Oh, yes. Here is what happened. Of course, the first thing she did was to go back to the ghetto and to go to the apartment when her her two surviving siblings and my cousin Yutka lived, and also my grandfather, my mother's father, who remarried the third time. My grandmother died in 1942 in illness, sickness. She wasn't explicit victim of the Holocaust, but she was victim of the circumstances. Anyway, we had a very close friend, or my grandparents, and my grandfather remarried. Her name was, we called her Aunt Sophia. And so they lived in Akácfa Street, which was part of the Budapest ghetto. That's how my mom contacted them, and actually I spent a lot of time with them because my mom frequently went to the countryside at that time to get food. There was no food available in Budapest. So what people did at that time was they went to the countryside and bartered whatever valuables they had, and clothes and jewelry for food. And they took whatever trains remained in service. They were overcrowded. People were traveling on the top of the train. I remember my mom took once with me, and I saw we went to the railway station early, so we were able to stay in the passenger cars, but people were traveling on the top of the train. And my mom told the story, one of her trips, she traveled on the top of the train, and it was so cold that she only survived because at that time she bartered a live goose. That was the first time and last time she bartered a live animal, and she brought back it to the rest of the family, and that the goose kept her warm. Well, anyway, she was very smart, had chutzpah. She brought back more food than we could eat, and she sold leftovers for good money. One of her food staple she brought back was yeast. She got a 2-pounder or 3-pounder big block of yeast. She cut it up to small portions and sold, actually bartered, because there was a tremendous inflation in Hungary that time. The banknotes were the millions and billions and trillions. It was crazy. But so, again, while she was away, I stayed with my grandparents and with my aunts. I shared bed with my cousin. I remember she was very aggressive. She was 3 weeks older, but she was a girl. She was better developed, and she chased me all around and beat me up. But other than that, we were good friends. I remember those times.
Did you go to school at that point?
I started school, when I was 6 years old, 1947. I went to a Jewish day school. Our religious life after was quite different for various reasons. My my mother stopped practically practicing Judaism. She just couldn't believe in a benevolent God who let the Holocaust happen, who took her husband away. So she lit the Shabbat candle. She taught me, actually she didn't teach me the Shema, one of the basic prayers in Judaism. She prayed over me while I grew up. Actually, this is how I learned it, by hearing it every time she tucked me in bed. I was 2-3 years old. She said the prayer and I memorized it and I knew it. I didn't know what it meant, but that was actually the only Jewish liturgy I knew until a long time when I returned to Judaism myself. So anyway, but it was important for my mom after the war that I would go to Jewish day school. And that's what I attended until second grade, 1949. The Hungarian government was taken over by the Communist Party with the help of the occupying Russian Soviet army. They confiscated all private properties, and including parochial schools. So my Jewish day school were turned into a high school, I believe, vocational high school for a long time. So I went to public school starting from actually the first year of second grade. I was in Jewish school, and the second half in the public school.
Did you experience anti-Semitism during that period of time in school?
No, I did not. Again, my real memories came back when I was 6-7 years old, and from there on. And so I grew up in a communist system which was anti-religion, anti-any religion. They didn't punish people to practice their religion, but they made it very hard because every job was a government job. Government confiscated all properties, all offices were government offices, all factories. So everybody was government employee. And they kept a close tab on every employee. And if somebody was reported going to church on Sunday or synagogue on Saturday, it showed up. And so people who were professionals, who were promotions dependent, was dependent on how the government evaluated them, not just their professional conduct, but private life. And so people stayed away from churches and synagogues. Some families secretly came together and tried to pass on their traditions. I knew a group of people in elementary school. They were Christians who got religious education through their parents. I had no religious education whatsoever. We went to synagogue on the high holidays. My mom kept that tradition alive. We did not observe Passover at home. a few times we went to the Budapest Jewish Community Center where they had a community Passover. I had no idea what was going on because I didn't know Hebrew. I wasn't aware of Jewish traditions, history. But I remember I attended it. I remember the awe I felt during the high holiday service. That was emotionally, spiritually, it was talking to my Jewish soul inadvertently at that time, and it helped me to return to the traditions my parents and grandparents later. So anti-Semitism, I personally did not been attacked or called dirty Jew. There were no swastikas. Again, government was against all kind of religion. But I remember one accident, coming home from school. We were 7th or 8th grade elementary school, and there were no school buses in Budapest. We walked to the school, and a bunch of guys who lived in the same area went always together in the morning and going home. And one day, two guys started to argue about something. Probably it was some favorite soccer team that was very popular in Hungary. Anyway, it escalated until they started to fight and pummel each other. And one guy blurted out, "I'm gonna kill you, you dirty Jew." And that hit me. I mean, not physically, but it wasn't against me, but this guy, who I didn't know he was Jewish, his name was Blum, I think Blum you pronounce in this country, B-L-U-M, which is a typical Jewish name, but that time I didn't know what Jewish names were. He was also a redhead. So although we didn't know our classmates' religion explicitly, maybe implicitly, but anyway, this guy was Jewish looking, and so this guy tried to hurt him by calling by name. And I couldn't stand it, so I got into the fight. I went home with a bloody nose. My mother said, "Please stay away." And actually later on, she used this accident to give me an incentive to change my name, because obviously this guy knew that I was Jewish because I was Grunwald, a Jewish-sounding name, although I didn't look as much Jewish as Mr. Blum. But anyway, so that's the only anti-Semitic accident I remember while I was still living in Hungary.
Was there any education or discussion about the Holocaust during those years?
No, that was something later on when I became familiar with my family history. Holocaust history hit me really very hard, that my mom didn't tell me anything about it. My relatives, surviving relatives, didn't tell me. I wasn't exposed to, some books were published between 1945 and 1949, when it was still a so-called democratic country. some memoirs about the Holocaust. I was too young to read it. They weren't available in libraries after the Holocaust. It wasn't taught in school. We were taught history, but the history, especially 20th century Hungarian history, was a kind of blurry, whitewashed. Hungary was complicit in the Holocaust. The Hungarian government, although communists were against the Nazis during the 30s, but the communist government, which actually had lots of people who were Nazis before the war, and they changed color after the war, and they became card-carrying communists. But anyway, whomsoever wrote the curriculum, he referred that area as Second World War. People died because it was a war, because of hunger or starvation, and that's it. They told the Hungarian about the Hungarian army's participation in the war and at the defeat by the great Soviet Red Army. But again, Holocaust, actually the name Holocaust didn't come about, I think, until the 1960s. It was, I don't even know what it was referred to until then, but the Jewish history of the Second World War and the actual Holocaust was never taught while I was in school. There were no movies, there were no books. In the 1960s, after the 1956 uprising was put down, there was a kind of thawing in Hungary, and Hungary became the most lenient country in the Soviet bloc, and there were some movies about World War II. Especially there was a horrible atrocity committed by the Hungarian army in the part of Yugoslavia which was taken back by the Hungarians in 1940 as a reward of being in alliance with the Germans. And so the Hungarian army marched in, and they executed hundreds, maybe thousands of people, not just Jewish, mostly Serbs who lived at that time at that area. And there was a movie about, I remember seeing it, but that was, again, the context wasn't the Holocaust. It was about those people. Actually, the officers of the army were tried and convicted. I don't know if they were executed or not, but the Hungarians took responsibility of that particular atrocity, but not the rest. Again, the Hungarian government, not until today, ever apologized for the more than 450,000 Hungarian Jews who died during the Holocaust.
So, after high school, you applied to university. Was there any problem in getting entry to the university?
Well, yes and no. I applied for university. The higher education system that time in Hungary was different what it was that time in the United States and what it is today. after high school, you went to medical school straight or law school straight and studied for 5 or 6 or 7 years to be a lawyer or a doctor or whatever professions you wanted. I wanted to be badly a lawyer, and I was applying. I wasn't accepted. Why, I don't know. I just got a notification that I wasn't accepted. At that time, 5, 8 times more people applied and they took in, so it may be just my qualification or my grades weren't good enough. In order to get to university at that time, you had to have maximum 20 points, which were divided at least 2 or maybe 3 sections. You got certain points on merits that you graduated with straight A, got a certain point or C or D, then less points. You were getting a certain number of points, how active you were in the Young Communist System or organization, which I wasn't very active, so I didn't get a lot of points there. And the third one was the worst, for me at least. You got certain points what your parents were before and during the war. If they were communist, you got the maximum points because there was a communist party. I think it was illegal, but nevertheless there was. Or your parents emigrated to the Soviet Union and came back with the Soviet army. That was the maximum point. The minimum point or no point was those who were called the enemy of the people, people who owned factories or were high-ranking government officials. My parents, my father was a clerk and office manager, nobody. My mom owned a business, her own business. She was a hat maker. She had 2 or 3 people working for her, but she wasn't a capitalist. Anyway, so I was in the second worst category, which was called others, which didn't fit the communists, didn't fit the blue-collar workers, or didn't fit in the category of being a peasant or agricultural worker. So I didn't get a lot of points because what my parents were before the war, and it was just so ironic that my father couldn't get into the college. He wanted to be a lawyer, but he couldn't get acceptance because there were a very strict law in Hungary way before the Nuremberg laws in Hungary, which restricted the Jewish students at colleges, universities to their proportion in the general population. And that was about 5 to 6% of the Jews in Hungary at that time. So that many Jews were allowed to go, and that was just a very minuscule portion of the people who were able to afford and had the talent to go. So my father didn't get to college because of racial or religious discrimination. I couldn't get into college because I implicitly were discriminated because my parents weren't blue-collar workers or peasants. So anyway, law school was out, and also that was a breeding ground to communist party leadership and high government offices, just like in this country. Most of the government high-ranking officers go to law school. Well, anyway, next year I decided maybe it would be easier if I go to another university where there were more students and more chances to get in. I applied to be a chemical engineer. That one, probably I blew it on merit also, because I wasn't very good at chemistry. I was a good student, and I worked in a laboratory for 1 year before I got to applied for the university. Anyway, I was rejected. I had no choice but to go to a vocational school, otherwise I would have been conscripted into the Hungarian army, and that was the last thing I wanted, so I went into a vocational school. I became an electric instrument maker, people who assemble radios and radars and instruments. So I became a blue-collar professional, and that helped me at my third try when I applied to be an electrical engineer. That time I fell in love with electronics, and so that's why I started college 3 years after graduating from high school. I was a good student. I got a master's degree in electrical engineering. I was lucky enough to get a job at a place. It was an electronic instrument making factory somewhere at the outskirts of Budapest, where they started to design and build the first Hungarian computer. And that's where I learned everything about computers, hardware, software, which really helped me for the rest of my life.
What year was this?
That was 1967 when I graduated, and I worked there until 1970-something, when there was a reorganization, and it's a long story. Anyway, I got an offer from the most prestigious Hungarian research institute, the Hungarian Research Institute for Nuclear Physics, where there was a computer department, and I got a job there where I worked with a computer which was built by that institution, and they wanted to be in the computer business also, but they didn't design from scratch. They copied an American computer which was very popular at that time. It's a long story. Anyway, I learned everything about that American computer hardware and software, which helped me a few years later when I defected from Hungary and I came to the United States.
Can you tell us a little more about how you got to the United States?
Well, first I had to leave Hungary, and again, that time I was married. It was a a perfect storm in so many ways that my marriage broke up, unfortunately, mostly because of me, but that's another story. I had a daughter from that marriage in Hungary. I had my mom and my stepfather, who still were alive, and my mom remarried when I was 14. My stepfather was a Holocaust survivor. He survived Auschwitz. He had the number tattooed, and again, that's a very sad story in my Holocaust story, because I never learned what happened to my stepfather. He never ever told me what that number was, and I couldn't ask him or force him because I didn't know what that number was. We weren't taught Holocaust history. We didn't know that people, and I think mostly or only people who went to Auschwitz had the numbers. Other camps, they just didn't have the tattoo. So she went through the horror of horrors, and I learned bits and pieces, but I still don't know history. Anyway, so I had a family in Hungary in 1980. At the same time, because of my job, I was privileged to go to Western Europe 4 or 5 times a year. I was part of an international organization sponsored by the EU. Most of the meetings were in Brussels, sometimes in Paris, London, or Vienna. And anyway, so I was exposed to Western life more than anybody of my peers because of these official trips. And also, finally, I knew that the communist propaganda we heard in Hungary was all fake, and we weren't beating the capitalist West. They lived much better than we did. But I personally had a very comfortable life in Budapest. I had apartment, I had car, I had a very good paying job. I was able to travel. So I wasn't forced to leave Hungary because of my physical circumstances. But the oppressiveness of the rent of the system really hit me hard. So the confluence of all these things said, I have to start a new life after divorce. I have to start from scratch. I might as well start it at the West. And so I had the opportunity to defect during my official trips, but I didn't have the chutzpah or the courage to do it. So every time on the last day of my trip, I was, should I go to the airport, should I not? I went. I came back. That made me a good, reliable, loyal citizen of Hungary, that I came back all the time. Anyway, 1980, again, I was about to start a new life. Where should I do it? I had my aunt and uncle living in Baltimore in the United States. I thought I'm going to visit them, see how life is in the United States, and maybe, just maybe, this time I will have the courage and would not go back. So I had a round-trip ticket. I came as a visitor, and long story, anyway, a few days before my departure, coming back to Hungary, my uncle, I had a good heart-to-heart conversation, And he hated Hungary, hated everything about Hungarian language. He intentionally forgot Hungarian. Actually, when he died, his Hungarian was much worse than my wife, who was born American, and she learned very good Hungarian. Well, anyway, off the tangent. He asked me why I was going back to Hungary. And I said all the good reasons: mom, stepfather, my daughter, good job, blah, 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 blah. He was appealing to my subconscious. He was an Orthodox Jew, an observant Jew. He went to shul twice a day, separate refrigerator for milk and flesh. And he asked about my religious background and commitment, and I told him the sad truth that I was a cultural Jew, but no religious whatsoever. Well, anyway, it just made me think, and I was thinking, and I decided not to go to the airport this time. I applied for political asylum. Good thing at that time was that I got a stamp in my passport that employment authorized while I was waiting for my case to be decided by the Immigration Service. Long story, very long story. My original application was rejected. Too much details. Anyway, I hired a lawyer. We figured out the best thing is to apply for another kind of visa because of my professional skills, which were in high demand at that time. And because by that time I had a good job, and the company which hired me was able to sponsor me and offer me a job which was really tailored for my specific skills. So when they had to, by law, had to advertise the job, so first they should advertise to all Americans, and if they cannot hire an American, then they can hire a foreigner like myself. I got accepted and got the green card, got married, started family, and the rest of is history.
So how did you make your way back to Judaism?
It was not a straight road. It was tipsy-turvy. I defected in July, end of July 1980. High holidays were coming up. I stayed at that time with my uncle, Uncle Lester, and he was a part of an Orthodox synagogue in Baltimore. And he tried to take me to his daily visit to the shul. Obviously, I had a job. I couldn't do it. He took me on Shabbat, and as a good nephew, plus returning his kindness, I went with him. It was all in Hebrew. I didn't understand anything. The Siddur, the prayer book, was Hebrew only. So I didn't really catch the spirit of Judaism. High holidays came around. I was a little bit offended by how it was conducted. I didn't know the American system where synagogues weren't supported by the government, like in Hungary at that time, the remaining one or two, but by contribution of the members. And checks were collected before the high holiday service started, and it was just so commercial for me, so foreign to me. I was really turned off by just this little thingy. Anyway, I thought maybe Orthodox Judaism is not for me. I tried Reform. I went to Baltimore Hebrew congregation, nice congregation, big building. The best part was I went usually Friday night services. They had the oneg, or whatever the meal is called after service. They had the best pastry in on this side of the Atlantic. But people were a kind of, I don't know, at Ner Tamid, at the Orthodox synagogue, people were very friendly. They took me in. In this synagogue, they were a kind of cliquish. Nobody talked to me, not even the rabbi. Well, anyway, one day the rabbi said something which was really detrimental to my coming back to Judaism, namely that the Torah was really not given by God, but it was written by a bunch of smart Jewish guys. This was his words. And that was something I wanted to believe in God, but if a synagogue says, well, God is just an imagination, then the most sacred thing in Judaism is invention, then what am I doing there? So I stopped going there. Anyway, make the long story short, finally I ended up in a conservative synagogue here in Potomac, Maryland, B'nai Tzedek, and I found my place within Judaism. Meantime, I studied Judaism at the JCC and at various congregations I attended. So I think I am, although I never got a Jewish education, I am better educated in Judaism, Torah, the Jewish Bible, even the Christian Bible than most boys who had bar mitzvah and never went back to the synagogue again. And yeah, it was kind of what is very fashionable today, to find your identity. When I came over, I left my Hungarian identity behind. I didn't have an American identity yet. Maybe I don't have now either. I'm not a full-blooded American, but I knew I was Jewish, and that's the identity I tried to grab and identify myself. Took many years, but now I am confident in my Jewish identity.
And when did you start talking about your Holocaust background to your family and to the public?
Well, I started to learn about the Holocaust after I got to the United States, because I didn't know Baptist, or I didn't know anything about it. So I had to start from scratch. I read many books, Elie Wiesel's book, The Night, historical books, movies. So by the early 90s, I was well educated in Holocaust history. I learned about the designing of a Holocaust museum. That time it was in the design phase. It opened in '93, if I remember correctly. But the solicitation for donation started much earlier. So being part of the Jewish community, I got on their mailing list, and I started to support the Holocaust Museum, which was at that time on paper only. And when it opened, I wanted to be a volunteer immediately, but I had a big family, and I had a very busy job, and I had to work way beyond my legal retirement age just to put through my 5 daughters to college and marry them off. So I worked until 2014 when I was 73 years old, when finally I felt financially secure enough that now I can retire. And the next few weeks I showed up at the museum and applied for a volunteer position. I was taken in. I started as a regular volunteer because I didn't know, number one, that I was a survivor by a certain definition, and the museum had a specific group for survivor volunteers. So I did whatever volunteers did at museum, visitor services, and taking a tour guide course, until somebody told me, actually he became a good friend of mine, who was a friend of mine in the synagogue, who was part of the survivor volunteer group, that I should join because I am qualified as a child survivor. And by that time, most of the people who were still alive were child survivors, from infants to teenagers, practically. Anyway, that's when I became member of the survivor volunteer group, where I was asked to do certain things only survivors did, namely tell my family story to various audiences who came to the museum, or we traveled all over the United States to colleges and various institutions where we told our story. So that's how it started.
And how do you think this survivor background, heritage, history that you have has impacted your life and your work, your life, your family?
Well, when I learned that I am a survivor, that was the first time I realized that I was a survivor, because it wasn't a category for me, it wasn't an identity for me. I survived not on my own merit, but because of my mom's merit, losing family members, growing up without a father. It was just a natural way of life. I mean, so many people lost their parents either because they were Jewish or because they were at the wrong place at the wrong time. So this survivor identity came about only when I learned about the real history. Later on, again, when I started to volunteer for the museum. So what influenced my life was really the life of my mother, who was the real survivor, who did everything for me, who lost everything she had, what was dear to her. And so her life, she didn't taught me Judaism, she didn't taught me that I have to work hard. She worked hard. She worked in 2 shifts after the war. She lost her business. She became a seamstress, and she worked on alternate weeks from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., other weeks 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. She was, we were poor, we were dirt poor, but everybody else were poor because even those who had means, they didn't show because that wasn't fashionable, weren't allowed. So whatsoever I am because of my mother, who is a survivor, and an example to me. The decisions I had to make in my life, I either discussed with her or was thinking about what would my mother do, or what would my mother choose. So I think that's who I am, and that's how being a survivor influenced our life. My survivor activities at the museum influenced me in so many ways, and my children's. Also learning other people's stories, meeting with audience, seeing how my story and my family story resonates with them, how they break down in tears when around 8th graders walked up to me after I told my story, and I told about the diary of my mom. She told me how touched she was, and she's going home and she will start a diary, and she will start it with my story. So those are the encounters which really affected my life and really enriched my life. I think I got more out of it than I put in it. And so I hope I can do as long as I breathe. And really, it's not a job for me, it's a real volunteer work, and the word enjoying it is not appropriate in the context, but I got real so much out of it, and strength and camaraderie with my fellow survivors, that I'm just really glad that I can do it.
How did your mother feel about your defection, and did she end up coming to the United States or staying in Hungary?
Yes, she visited us frequently. Actually, The last time she came, we celebrated her 90th birthday here in 1997, October. And she usually visited us during the winter. The summers are very brutal here, although lately in Hungary also. But anyway, she spent 2 or 3 months with me and my children. And we offered so many times to stay with us permanently, but she just wanted to go back. She wanted to have her independent life. That time, 2 of her sisters were still alive in Budapest, many good friends. She was able to take care of herself. And so that wasn't an option for her to come permanently. As her life, she was extremely happy that I turned back to Judaism, to the extent that she turned back to Judaism. So the first time she came and we had the Erev Shabbat dinner, and my wife, who is not Jewish, but she is very much immersed in Judaism, lit the Shabbat candles. My mom was in tears. They both said the traditional prayer together, and she went back home. And from there on, she did light the candle on her own, all by herself, but she did. And so it came to a full circle. She instilled me my Jewish identity, and in return I reinforced her Jewish identity.
And how has this impacted your daughters? Do they Holocaust education?
Well, in so many ways, whomsoever I am, that's the father they got. They had no choice. I think we have an extremely good relationship. Knowing other families, maybe because they are daughters, maybe because I try to do or give them what I didn't get because I didn't have a father. But again, from early childhood, we really had a very close relationship. They were even teenagers, and they came home from, I hope they are not going to watch this interview, but I tell anyway. They came home from dates, and they came to my office. I was still on my computer. They sat down sometimes on my lap and told what happened at school. So this close family relationship, it's still there. And that's what they got from me, from my mother, whom they always refer to by her nickname, first name, which is very unusual in this country. They just call her Olgi. She's a living presence in our home. Every time there is a noise, we don't know where it's coming from. It must be Olgi. And so she's hunting them in a very good way. They became good people. They graduated all high school. They have good marriages, grandchildren, granddaughters, 6 of them. So we are still waiting for a boy in this family, but I have son-in-laws, and God blessed us with good son-in-laws also. And my youngest daughter, who was history major, among others, before she became interested in social work, one of her term papers, or that was her final term paper, she interviewed 4 Holocaust survivors, Hungarian speaking, not necessarily Hungarian, because one was Slovakian, the other was Yugoslavian. Anyway, but they were ethnically Hungarians in those areas. So her term paper was about Holocaust in Hungary, and she used the interviews as sources for her paper. She befriended them on a personal level. She is still visiting one of them, who is an assisted living home. He's an assisted living home, sorry, and they have lunch together at least once a month.
Is there anything else that you would like to tell your, whoever might be watching this video, family, friends, the public, about any lessons learned or anything else you want to impart?
We touched practically everything. 2 stories which I tell during my presentation, if we have time. Unfortunately, we always have limited time, and I don't know how much are we into this interview. Not that I'm worried about time, but one story is, and it gives you an insight of how people lived and felt during the Holocaust. At one point, one of my mom's friend suggested her to convert to Christianity. There was a rumor in Budapest that those who convert to Christianity will be protected, and although their husbands were already taken, at least them and their children will survive. So my mother said, anything I'm going to do just to survive, and if it takes converting, why not? So many people converted even before the Holocaust. They just wanted to assimilate to the extent that they just changed their religion. So my mother started to take conversion classes, and with a Catholic priest. Actually, she took only one class. She told me later that she went, the priest, I don't think he said anything derogatory about Judaism, because Hungary is mostly a Catholic country, and Catholics teach that Jews are Christ killers, we kill their God. So I don't know whether that priest told her or just told something, or which made her rethink this whole thing. Okay, I'm going to save my life, but I'm not going to leave my heritage. That's my mother thinking that she was thinking 2000s of Jewish history, and Jewish people only survived because they practiced religion. They practiced their language. They preserved their language. So she just could not bring herself to kneel before another God. So that was one story sometimes I tell. Sometimes I invite it to religious school, Christian schools. And in the context now, they can really relate it to what happened or what Jewish people felt or feel today even about Christianity. The other story is related to Hungary's complicity in World War II and the annihilation of 3 out of every 4 Jewish person who died during the Holocaust. It was the Germans who built the camps in Poland. It was the Germans who designed the gas chambers and the crematories. But it was, in many cases, local governments in France and Holland and Hungary who rounded up the Jewish people, who took them, kept them in ghettos, took them to the railway stations. Sometimes they went all the way to the border before they were passed on to the Germans. And unfortunately, Hungary was the last ally of Nazi Germany, and Hungarians never took responsibility. They claim officially until today, well, we were occupied in March 1944, and it was the Germans, and it was really not. It was Hungarian military police officers who were personally involved, and government authorities who wrote all those anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic laws. But not everybody, not all Hungarians. I don't hate Hungarians just because they are Hungarians. There were good ones. There are many Hungarian names at Yad Vashem, at the wall of the righteous Gentiles. And one of them was, well, actually not, his name is not on the wall because we don't know his name, but he was a high-ranking officer in the Hungarian army, and during the last few months of the Holocaust, when Jews were allowed to go out for a couple of hours to do their shoppings, my mom went out, and as she went to the grocery store, a high-ranking Hungarian officer, army officer, stopped her. And my mom was hurtling, shaking, because it was really a bad sign if somebody in uniform stopped a Jewish woman with the yellow Star of David on her coat. And this officer saluted my mother, and he told her, "Madam, I am sorry for what my government is doing for you and for your people. I don't know who he was. I don't know what he did in his capacity as an army officer. but he was a human being. And I am sure my mom never said it explicitly, but it gave her strength that not all humanity is bad or evil. And probably it's part of our survivors that her tenacity and her will to survive was really strengthened by this.
I think that's a beautiful story, quite to end this. Thank you so much for your interview and your thoughtfulness and your willingness to tell your story.
I appreciate that I had this opportunity. I appreciate that you are crying with me, but I think crying is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. And again, thank you so much.
I don't know where the artifacts are, but
Yes.
can we bring them in now?
And if I get a napkin, is it still rolling?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
And you can just tell me what you want to talk about first, and I can just bring it
Bring the diary first.
Yes. No. We can start that one. Do you want to go chronological order? Then start with the pictures of my grandparents.
This one?
Show the other side. The other side, yeah, that one.
You can
You put them up on
hold it, or you can. put it
Yeah,
here.
we can put it here. So this is my great-grandfather, David Neuwirth, who was a rabbi in the late 1980s in Eperjes that time. Today is Prešov, Slovakia. He was a rabbi as long as the synagogue existed, and he was a rabbi emeritus after he became old. He lived to the ripe age of 95. He died in 1945. He was about to deported, but he was really frail and old. They let him stay, and he died some because of his old age. My grandparents, my mother's parents, Grunwald Samuel or Samuel Grunwald, and Regina or Regina Neuwirth, my grandmother. Turn of the last century. You can see that's the only picture, professionally made picture of my father, my mom, and myself. I was about 3 or 4 months old. The pictures right here, my mom and my father on the day of their wedding, 1937, June 20th, I believe. That's a picture my father in the forced labor service with all the other Jewish men. He is right on the top of there are a few other pictures. One is on himself on a horse. His position at one point was to deliver the mail, and the post office was far from the camp, so he learned how to ride the horse, and that's what he did. The pictures here, I think, yes, that was, I believe, me as a newborn in the apartment building. My parents lived at that time in Budapest. Probably my father took the picture, my mom, and I am there naked with my dad. I don't know if I have another set of pictures or if not, then maybe that. No, that one is the last one. The notebook you showed me the first time, that one. Yes. My parents were part of a tourist group before the Holocaust in the 1930s, even during their dating, and all the way until 1940 when they could go hiking. And this tourist group wasn't specifically geared towards Jewish people, but somehow most of the members were Jewish. They were close friends of my parents. This is the insignia or whatever it's called of the group itself. This one survived the Holocaust because this was so precious for my mom that she took everywhere. And this is a typed diary of my father and two of his friends who one winter went to Austria on a ski trip. And this is the diary, what happened to them, the English translation, the Three Musketeers story. And then they tell the story. It's hand illustrated. There are Mickey Mouse on one of the pages. I don't know if my father did. I don't know about his artistic talent, but there are some pictures about their trip in Austria and their good life before the Holocaust. So this one plus the next one I want to show is the diary my mother started during the Holocaust. That one.
This one?
We can put it here. My mom started to write down what was happening to us during the Holocaust. She didn't want to write a diary. She just wanted to remember everything, what happened to us during the Holocaust. She hoped that one day my father would come back and she would able to recall using this diary. So the first volume is actually was a notebook she used to write down her customers' data. She was a female hat maker, so she wrote down their names, their address, their phone numbers, and in between pages she wrote down certain things, what happened. One page tells all the funny words when I started to speak. Hungarian language is a hard language, and a little 2 or 3 old boy definitely. So all the funny words are in the diary. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to tell my father or my father to read it, but it is good for me that I can recall many things my mother never told me, especially because it's her personal feelings. So this is one resource of my family's Holocaust history. The other postcards, I have a thick stack of postcards like this one. My father sent from the camps wherever they were taken. And we don't know where the postcards came from because his unit was attached to a military unit, so it was secret where they were. We know some idea we have that he was stationed when Hungary took back to part of Yugoslavia, which was originally part of Hungary, and some of the troops were sent there. My father never attended in those horrible actions I was talking about earlier. Anyway, my mom preserved all the cards throughout all the nightmarish history of the Holocaust. This is the very last one my father sent, full with love for my mom and for me, and with hope and prayers for a better future. So I am in the process of translating these first for my family, my children and grandchildren, and I intend to donate to the Holocaust Museum, where they have diaries and postcards and memorabilia of survivors. So I think that's it. There is one, if that little bag, if you can give me. That's a special thing for my father. Jewish people, when they pray, they use a leather box and leather belt to wrap around their arm and put this box over their temple. This is a verse in the Bible that God's word should be between your eyes, and you should teach them. Anyway, Jewish males, when they pray in the morning, they use this one. And Jewish boys, when they reach the age of 13, they have a rite of passage, or if I call that the so-called bar mitzvah, when they are taking on themselves of the commandments of the Torah as adults, and they are gifted with this tefillin. And it survived the Holocaust because it was precious for my mom, and now it's precious for myself and my children and grandchildren.
Did you want to read?
Excuse me?
Did you want to read something from the diary?
Do I have a page of the diary in printed form? Don't take it out. There is not a separate one. No. Let me see. Maybe that's white paper in the folder. Yeah, that one, if I can take it out. Yeah, that's the one. This is the last letter I showed earlier, and this is the contents with my best English. Some of the things just cannot be translated. They mean so much in Hungarian if you use the verb verbatim, but it might be funny in English. Anyway, my mother nickname in Hungarian was Mókus, which the name of a little animal, squirrel. And so it's a term of endearment when she addresses my dear little squirrel and my golden little Peter. I got all of your cards, and they caused me great pleasure, and I ask you to write more often, because reading those lines, they are like a special holiday for me. Your cards are full with longing for me, and can you imagine how much I long for you and for our little cozy home? But for the time being, we have to be very patient. We have to wait steadfastly and trust in the good Lord. I cannot emphasize how much you have to take care of yourself. My dear little squirrel, please write exhaustively about yourself and our little Peter, and please send lots of pictures. I gaze on those pictures, and they give me strength to struggle. When I get home, we will talk a lot. The work is very hard, but I am getting stronger, and thanks to God, I can endure in good health. My dear little squirrel, I was so happy to read that our little dear Peter is maturing nicely, and he is becoming a real person. I think, or I am afraid, that he will not recognize his papa, but I hope he will have time, opportunity to get to know me. Sorry, that's all I can read right now. Thank you. Finally, just to close the story, this is a picture, this is the highlight of my career. I worked for almost 40 years for NASA. I participated as a computer engineer, system engineer in many great projects, the Space Shuttle, the Hubble Space Telescope, and the last project was the James Webb Space Telescope, which after a long design and building, I couldn't wait until it was launched. I retired in 2014. It was launched this last year, but I had a very significant work on it. And one day I worked at the Goddard Space Flight Center just outside Washington, D.C., and the model, a life-size model of the James Webb Telescope was brought into the center, and all the people who participated in this project lined up. And I am somewhere here, probably you won't recognize. Sometimes I use as a riddle for people to try to recognize me in this picture. Of course, I was 30 years younger or 20 years younger. But I loved my work. Actually, my children didn't want me to retire, not because of the money, but because cannot brag about their papa who worked for NASA. And but anyway, God gave me this great opportunity. I'm really glad that I had a great professional career.
Wonderful.
Thank you for all of your help, just being here, helping me, and encouraging me.
Oh, thank you. It was an honor. It was a privilege. I think we're concluded.
House lights coming up.
Are we
You're
still
so
on?
articulate. You're very articulate.
Yes.
Are we still on? Because I have a question. I don't want to be on camera.
Yep, camera's cut off.
I don't know if I did it or not, but sometimes I mess up my pronouns. In Hungarian language, there are no he or she. They were way ahead of the current trend. So we have everybody as it. And although I learned the English language, I have a good vocabulary. I think sometimes I help my wife with English words she doesn't know. But my brain is not wired that way and never been rewired that if I start a sentence talking about a female, that if I reference in the same sentence or the next one, I should use the proper he or she.
I think you were pretty perfect.
And so I don't know if I talk about my father as she or my mother as he, but that's one thing which caused me.
It was maybe once that you did.
Oh, okay. Anyway,
And
if
that was it. It was fine. It was perfect.
I am sure that people, sometimes it is confusing, especially when there are more persons involved in one sentence and a couple of sentences, but at least I can explain.
No, I think it really, you were amazingly articulate and it worked.
Oh my.
Oh,
Hey, Bonnie, we just told
hard to
Stevie
stand
where
up.
it was,
Oh,
right?
goodness. Well, we've been
We told
sitting
the
for
house,
2.5,
just
almost
where it
3
was.
hours.
Oh my. Actually, my leg went sleep.
Okay, cool. Do we need to give him the memory card or no? He just pulls it from it. I think it's That's what happened last time, yeah.
Well, they had an issue with them.
Yeah, stretch
Is
them
that
out
the
a
one
little
Josh
bit.
just did or the one before that?
No, the one before.
No, I remember
Yeah.
because I had to get memory card.
Right, so the last one we didn't use.
Okay, good.
So it's really back up, we're gonna see it back up.
Right. Okay, cool.
Should be good.
Yeah, so just, I guess ping me if he has trouble finding, or tell him to ping me, he knows where I am,
Yeah,
so.
okay, but they know, yeah.
It should be, it'll say Wednesday, and it should say show, I had them label it, so.
Right.
Oh, I am still wired.
That should be good.
Anything
Oh,
else on
oh
this?
yeah, he just, the
Oh, the
wire, or the mic.
You forgot to unmic.
I
it.
just don't wanna take all of
No,
your
no.
equipment down.
Oh, and I need
There we
pictures,
go.
I wanna take pictures of you all.
Okay.
Let me see, should I have the lights, can you turn the lights back on?
Yeah, sure.
And I will give you.
What time is it, guys?
Oh.
Out of curiosity.
It is 1:15.
Mhm.
There we go. I can turn this
Yeah, I
on.
wanna take pictures. I can just, do I just unplug the lights?
Yeah, it's literally the power strips, just a
Just,
switch.
oh, okay, okay, great.
Rudi Hamilton.
So
Yeah.
just do the power.
Uh,
Literally just like the